Welcome to this explainer. Let's jump right in because today we're unpacking something absolutely fascinating and honestly pretty terrifying. We're going to explore a grim, dark, gothic fable that essentially maps out the anatomy of nihilism. Think of it as a philosophical deep dive into the terrifying rise of a figure known as the inkblot demon. By tapping into Goethean philosophy and Nietzschean philology, we're going to break down exactly how this dark entity comes into existence, moving from its very creation all the way to absolute consumption.
So, to kick things off, think about this for a second. What actually happens when we try to completely suppress our deepest, darkest drives in a relentless quest for absolute purity? Well, as we'll see through the sources today, that suppression doesn't just make those drives magically disappear. No, it literally births an active architect of our own destruction. To really grasp how this works, we need to look at three distinct parables. Let's start with the parable of the stained sanctum. The philological root of our demon begins with a meticulous monk. This guy wanted to transcribe the ultimate word of purity. He firmly believed that if he just strictly adhered to the laws of grammar and logic, he could completely transcend his own base instincts. But here's the catch. Every single time his quill touched his pristine parchment, a tintenklecks or an ink blot would bloom. And this wasn't just some clumsy stain. It was a tinctura acting as a literal metaphysical medium for all that denied internal chaos.
Now, this internal struggle introduces our next big concept, the will. This is the primordial will. It represents all those repressed human instincts and unwritten drives the monk was desperately trying to ignore. And as he tried to control his writing even more rigidly, his repressed will essentially commissioned this ink. It didn't just sit there drying on the page. It began to transform, merging into this writhing, inker-like horror that literally rose right up from his desk. Look at the stark contrast in the monk's reality here. On one hand, he viewed his soul as the pristine canvas, which was just a complete delusion of absolute purity. But the actual truth? That was the living ink. He realized, way too late, that this ink wasn't some record of his holy devotion. It was a devouring architect. Because he flat out refused to acknowledge his own nature, that very nature took physical form to personally oversee his terminal downfall.
But here's the thing, the danger of repression isn't just an individual problem. It scales up massively. And that brings us to the parable of the Iron Citadel, where we meet Nietzsche's concept of der Geist der Schwere, or the spirit of gravity. Nietzsche warned that this is humanity's greatest internal enemy. In our fable, a sovereign commands his subjects to build this massive citadel of absolute law, built entirely on objective morality, and in doing so, he inadvertently force-feeds this exact crushing enemy.
I mean, just look at the unbelievable burden they created for themselves. Every single stone of this citadel was a decree. The sovereign draped his knights in incredibly heavy iron and these suffocating cloaks of dogma. And the tragic irony here is that he mistakenly believed this massive moral weight was strength. He thought it was holding the world together. But in reality, piling up all this moral mass just fed the spirit of gravity, causing the collective soul of the entire citadel to sink into nihilism and deep self-loathing. And how this gravity manifests is just incredibly chilling. It didn't march in like some conquering army. It arrived as a creeping purple mist, bringing this suffocating vertical pressure. What's so fascinating, and frankly terrifying, is that this pressure didn't make the citadel walls crumble. No, the sheer weight of their collective guilt simply flattened the knights directly into the earth. It left behind nothing but hollowed-out, decapitated armor, a perfect, gruesome monument to their terrifying regression into emptiness.
Which brings us to our third tale, the parable of the sculptor's dead end. To really understand his failure, we've got to look at Goethean philosophy. You have Gestalt, which represents frozen, perfect form. And then you have Werden, which is the dynamic, ever-changing cycle of becoming and growth. In our story, a master sculptor tried to capture the perfect Gestalt of life. He attempted to completely freeze the dynamic cycle of Werden into a single, eternal moment. Basically, he entirely ignored the core Goethean principle that destruction is a vital, necessary catalyst for new growth. And by choosing to suppress all natural negation and decay, the sculptor triggered a horrifying reaction. A vibrant, acidic green fire erupted directly from his tools. And this wasn't some beautiful, creative spark of inspiration. It was a core of pure negation. This acidic fire began to violently consume every single statue he had carved, literally absorbing the life force of his art right into its own glowing solar plexus.
Now, in a normal, constructive dialectic, destruction actually clears the way for new art and growth. It's a natural cycle. But because this sculptor tried to force absolute frozen perfection, he distorted the dialectic entirely. That green fire didn't clear the way for anything new. It resulted in a terminal dead end, leaving his ancient workshop in a total state of chaotic formlessness and pure negation. So, if we pull back for a second and look at these three parables together, we can clearly map out the clinical progression of this philosophical disease, with the sources called the anatomy of nihilism. Step 1 is the burden of dogma, where humans just crush themselves under oppressive moral weight. Step 2 is the manifestation of the shadow. That's where the suppressed will doesn't die off, but actually rises up as a violent tyrant. And finally, step 3 is terminal emptiness, where the human vessels are entirely emptied of their vital spirit. Now, the source material does something absolutely striking to wrap up this analysis. It hands the microphone directly over to the entity born from all this repression. So listen closely to the words of the inkblot demon, speaking directly to us from the void. Look upon me, you pathetic scribblers of truth and virtue. You believe you hold the pen, yet you are merely the inkwells from which I draw my sustenance. I am the Dostoimonisha archetype. I am the physical autonomy of every single drive you were too cowardly to name. I do not merely record your descent into the abyss. I dictate the shadow. I transform the very unwritten impulses you tried so desperately to bury into the active architect of your own destruction. Your objective morality and chivalric striving were never shields. They were the heavy iron that ensured the spirit of gravity would find you. I am the violent inversion of your Übermensch. Where you sought to rise above and sublimate your impulses into creation, I provide the suffocating vertical pressure that pins you to the stone. I have consumed your forced perfection, your gestalt. I have turned your dynamic becoming, your Werden, into a terminal void. You tried to halt the natural order, and in return, I have emptied your vessels of their vital spirit. Your history is now written in my living ink. It is not a story of moral progress or enlightenment. It is a masterpiece of self-sabotage. It is a monument to your repressed guilt, where the suppressed will finally reigns supreme.
Wow. Okay, stepping back from the demon's monologue for a second, I want to leave you with this final, genuinely haunting thought. Throughout this whole explainer, we've seen how attempting to forcefully deny our chaotic nature only empowers it. It literally takes our desire for purity and twists it into a weapon of total negation. So ask yourself this. When the repressed will finally smiles its sinister grin over the flattened remains of your vanity, who truly held the pen? Was it you? Or was it the shadow you refused to acknowledge?